Well, it's wonderful to see so many old friends here tonight, and wonderful to have this opportunity, thanks to the ICAA, to introduce Richardson and his drawings to this New York audience. The Richardson Collection in Houghton Library is one of the great unknown resources of American architecture. There are over 4,000 drawings created by Richardson and his studio assistants. And up until now, they have been virtually unseen, partially because of the size of the collection and partially because of the extreme fragility of the drawings. And so it's really been a great opportunity for Chris and Hope and me to be able to work with the Houghton staff and spend 5 years going through that entire collection, and then to be able to make a selection that we've now put into this book of 450 drawings. And with this, we just want to give our heartfelt thanks to Elizabeth White, our editor at Monticelli Press, and everyone at Monticelli who made this such a beautiful book, including the wonderful book designer, Jenna Schur. And the other person we also really want to thank is Jim O'Gorman, who is the great expert on Richardson's architecture and has been a mentor and an inspiration to us all the way through. There are a lot of stories you could tell about the Richardson drawings. What we're going to do tonight is to focus on three themes. The first is to give a short overview of Richardson's life and his career, to put these drawings in context. Then we're going to talk about the drawings themselves, how they were made, and who made them. Because one of the things that is most interesting about Richardson is he is the exact opposite of the stereotype of the architect as a lone wolf genius. Richardson had a genius for collaboration. And one of the things that the drawings help us understand is this collaborative process of design within his studio. And so then we're going to close with a wonderful case study, Austin Hall at the Harvard Law School, and that really allows us to show this collaborative design process at work. Richardson is often thought of as a quintessentially Boston architect. He went to Harvard, he had his home and his studio in the Boston suburb of Brookline, and the largest concentration of his buildings are in the Boston area. But in fact, he was a Southerner. He was born and raised in New Orleans and first came to the North in 1856 as a Harvard undergraduate. He made a great many friends in college. He was always warm and gregarious. Many of them would become his clients. Among them was the future historian Henry Adams. And he also, at this time, conceived the idea of becoming an architect. There were no architecture schools in the United States at the time, and so he convinced his family to allow him to go to Paris and to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was only the second American to study architecture there, and at the École, he got this superb academic training, particularly with the notion of the partie, a kind of sketch by which the architect is trained to capture the spatial essence of a design, how to organize the complexity of the program into a clear, logical organization which can then carry out and become the continuing touchstone for the further development of the design. This is actually an unbuilt project from early in his career, would have been a hospital in Worcester, and this sketch, I think, captures the kinds of partie drawings that he would have learned at the École. While Richardson was in Paris, the Civil War broke out. He was in an agony of indecision about what to do. His political sympathies by this point were entirely with the North, but he was deeply worried about his family in New Orleans. He wrote to Henry Adams and his other friends, "What should I do?" And they all counseled him, "Stay where you are. You know, there's nothing that you can do to go back home. Continue your education, just wait out the war." And that is what he did. When he ran out of money, he took a job with Henri Labrouste, a leading French government architect of the time. And so by the time he came back to New York in 1865, he had not only the best academic training available, but also the best professional training available for any American architect of his generation. Richardson came straight back here to New York. He never went back to the South. He started an office on Lower Broadway, started to build up an office staff, started to win commissions. And in his early work, you can start to see that at the same time that he was so deeply versed in French Beaux-Arts classicism, he also was deeply versed in the English Gothic revival. He understood how to decompose a building into these asymmetrically balanced volumes, and particularly the attention to material and to color and to texture and to the spatial context. And so it's this combination of the classical and the Gothic traditions that Richardson is able to fuse into an architecture that is uniquely his own. One more important thing happened in New York, and that was that he made friends with Frederick Law Olmsted. The two of them were neighbors on Staten Island, and they connected immediately. They would become lifelong friends and collaborators. And I just want to read what Olmsted said about Richardson, because I think it really gives a sense of how he was as an artistic collaborator. Olmsted said, "He would take such an eager, unselfish, and really vital interest in one's aims and schemes, be so intensely and intelligently sympathetic, that he was the greatest comfort and the most potent stimulus that has ever come into my artistic life." So those words from the one great design genius of post-Civil War America about the other, I think, really speaks to his qualities. In 1872, Richardson's life was transformed when he won the National Design Competition for Trinity Church on Copley Square in Boston. And you see here on the upper left-hand corner, that was his initial partie sketch, where he was organizing the church, a linking cloister, and the parish house on the irregular trapezoidal site. Underneath it is one of the competition-winning drawings, this one made by Charles McKim, at the time his leading design assistant. And then to the right, the final design of that central tower, this a very beautiful perspective sketch by Stanford White. With Trinity Church underway, Richardson believed that his future lay in Boston. He moved first his family to Boston, then he dissolved his New York office and started a studio there in Brookline. And over the next decade, a flood of designs came out where he grappled with all of the different design opportunities that the post-Civil War boom in America made possible. This is a very romantic civic building in the town of Northeaston for his leading clients, the Ames family, who made 2/3 of the world's shovels in this little hamlet. At the same time, Richardson was essentially inventing what Vincent Scully has come to have us know as the shingle style. Here with one of his most beautifully simplified and relaxed houses, the Stoughton House on Brattle Street in Cambridge. He also was doing monumental civic urban buildings, this courthouse, his major final building in Pittsburgh, where he fused the highly complex symmetrical Beaux-Arts plan to deal with the program, at the same time imbuing it with his own very personal architectural expression. And then with commercial buildings, the famous Marshall Field Warehouse in Chicago, the building that really showed Louis Sullivan and his Chicago contemporaries the artistic possibilities of the modern office building and skyscraper. In 1885, Richardson stood so high above his fellows that when the AIA had a poll of the 10 most beautiful buildings in the United States, 5 of them were by Richardson, with Trinity Church at the top of the list. The next year, he was dead. He died when he was 47, at the height of his career. His death was a shock, even though he had been sick for a long time. He had suffered from untreatable kidney disease. He had other infections and diseases. There were times when he would spend weeks in bed, and his office staff would carry the drawings upstairs and pin them to the cork walls of his bedroom so that he could continue to give crits to the projects that were underway. But still, the death was a great shock, and it was to his three young assistants, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, who formed a successor firm, that we first owe the completion of his buildings in a very faithful manner, including the Pittsburgh Courthouse and the Marshall Field Store. And also we owe to them the preservation of the drawings collection. They saved the 4,000 plus drawings, kept them in their own offices up until 1942, and then in that year when Harvard had just completed Houghton Library, when there was now a modern climate-controlled rare book library that would be a safe repository, they were given to Harvard, and that's where they have been ever since. So let me now talk a little bit about the drawings themselves and our process. Some of the drawings are very large, like this competition drawing for a cathedral in Albany. He did not win this competition. And they had to be sort of ferried through underground tunnels to various rooms that we were in. Our project went on for 5 years. It went on all through the pandemic, as you can see, with Hope and me here, properly masked up. The library itself was actually under renovation for about a year, and so we were kind of camping out in whatever space they could find for us as we worked our way through all 4,000 drawings. Some of them, as I said, very large, and some of them, like this board of small sketches on trace paper, very small, some only 2 or 3 inches square. The challenge was that although the drawings had been roughly cataloged by project, that was as far as it went. No one had ever tried to reconstruct the design process, to try to trace where the design had begun, what evolution it might have gone through, and how it wound up at its final stage. And that was really the task that we set ourselves in going through all of the drawings, was to reconstruct the design process, because as you will see, this is a collection that really gives the entire range of drawings that come out of an architecture office. The beginning point, wherever we had it, was Richardson's own sketches. For the first 10 years or so of his practice, he kept these in this bound notebook that is at Houghton on brown paper. These are a series of studies for the mental hospital in Buffalo, where he was testing out different plan organizations upon the Kirkbride scheme of mental hospital. And also, you can see in the middle a small elevation sketch where he's starting to think three-dimensionally as well. This is a series of sketches, plan sketches for a house for his client in Buffalo, William Dorsheimer, and you can see over there on the left, work life and daily life was all mixed in. That's a ticket to class day exercises in Harvard Yard. Clearly, Richardson had gone back for an alumni event, and he just tacked it here into the book. And then this is another very typical one. This is a series of plan studies of the Watts Sherman House in Newport, one of the turning points that Scully has identified in the development of the shingle style. And you see here, as you see on many of the drawings, these columns of figures. Clearly, he is constantly checking quantities, adding up square footages, adding up cubic feet of masonry, multiplying it by cost numbers, trying to sort of double check the design to see where does this stand within the client's budget. And that's a constant. But the other great thing about this spread is this is one of the great aha moments in the entire collection. This drawing that is scrawled across at a diagonal across here is his final solution to the central tower of Trinity Church. At this point, 1874, the church was already under construction. They'd driven all the foundations, but he had never been happy with the design of that tower. And also, the engineers kept coming back and saying, it's too heavy. The pile foundations are not going to support all the weight of that masonry. You have to keep simplifying. And so here is that sketch where he suddenly captures, this is how I'm going to do it, turns the sketch then over to Sanford White, and that is when this very beautiful perspective was created. In his later years, Richardson would work on any piece of paper that came to hand. Often he would work with these pieces of blue stationery with his name on the upper left-hand corner. This is an unbuilt project for a house for one of the Ames family on Commonwealth Avenue. And here you can see this is quite characteristic that he would draw with a soft pencil, and then as he starts to find the plan taking a clearer form, then trace over that in ink with the shape that it has now taken. And you will also see the cardinal points of the compass here in the upper right-hand corner. Clearly a reminder to himself of how the sun is moving around all of the rooms of the house, different times of day, different months of the year, and so what qualities of light and heat you're going to be getting into this design. Here's a good set of partie sketches for the Billings Library at the University of Vermont, where again you can see here he's thinking simultaneously in plan, in front elevation, and thinking through the three-dimensional massing of the library. And this is another of our favorite drawings in the collection. This is for the rectory of Trinity Church. The carefully traced plan and elevation would have been done by the design assistant, H. Langford Warren. But then what you can see on the drawing overlaid on that are words, numbers, notations, little sketches. Some of them very simple up here in the upper right-hand corner looking at the section. Here's an elevation view turned sideways of the fireplace here. Here, a study of a dormer window. Here's a detail of how that gable is going to end. And what you can see here is clearly Richardson and Warren sitting at a desk, the drawing between them, and their pencils are talking to each other. This is the fluidity of that collaborative design process as they are looking at the drawing, thinking it through, coming up with new possibilities, new enhancements, new variations. So let me now actually turn to the studio, because that was another of our fascinations. Of the roughly 4,000 drawings, only about 200 are from Richardson's own hand. All the rest are by the studio. And one of the great fascinations and paradoxes of Richardson's architecture is that he maintained such a distinctive style. There were really only 3 architects whose names have given rise to an adjective. There's Palladian architecture, there's Miesian architecture, and there's Richardsonian. And yet, this highly distinctive architecture was created by other hands. He had, half of his genius was the ability to select and train the most talented architects, to allow them each to give their own flavor to the design, and yet at the same time to always maintain an overall design control. Again, not only were none of the drawings dated, almost none of the drawings are initialed or signed. So we had to make inferences about who worked on which project. Sometimes by timing, we knew who was in the office when. There were some letters, some documents, but a lot of it was also studying the drawings themselves and trying to recognize the distinctive hands of the different studio assistants. The first in this sequence is Charles McKim. McKim had followed Richardson to Harvard and then to the École des Beaux-Arts. He also was deeply versed in Ruskinian Gothic as well as the Beaux-Arts classicism. And this is one of the magnificent drawings for the competition-winning design for Trinity Church, where McKim has created this glorious section, giving a sense of the play of light within the space, as well as a beginning indication of how this would be a fully painted, decorated church. This, of course, if you know the church, what John Lafarge and his team of artists created goes far beyond this, but the idea of the painted church was already here in the competition. When McKim moved on, Stanford White became the principal assistant and continued to play that role for another 6 years. White was the most gifted artist who ever came through Richardson's studio. He was only 16 when he entered, and so his entire architectural education was in the Richardson studio. And, the drawings that flow from him, this wonderful watercolor study of the exterior, the west front of the New York State Capitol in Albany is one of his. And he had a particular flair for interiors. And, this magnificent section elevation of the Senate chamber in Albany, where, as Chris likes to marvel, somehow he just got hold of a little bit of gold leaf and threw that on the paper as well to just give it that extra pop. He was, remarkable in many ways. When White left to join McKim in their new practice, H. Langford Warren became the next leading assistant. He had been trained in England in the office of a Gothic revivalist before going to MIT. And so he had a wonderful feeling for color and material and for a kind of a variety of different ways of putting the elements together. Another assistant was Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow. He was a nephew of the famous poet, thought quite highly of himself, and wrote many letters to his mother, where we get some very interesting gossip about what went on in the studio from these letters. Longfellow ultimately started a practice called Longfellow, Alden, and Harlow. They became the leading architects of Pittsburgh, including the Carnegie Institute. They did many buildings in the Boston area, and Longfellow had a particular interest in the 18th century colonial architecture. So this Surlian window that is floating in the midst of this otherwise sort of powerfully asymmetrical rustic facade for the Robert Treat Paine House in Waltham, is a contribution of Longfellow's. We also attribute to Longfellow a wonderful sequence of the Glessner House. If you know the Glessner House in Chicago, there was a larger mass block on Prairie Avenue and then a long lower service wing. And where those two wings come together is the key joint in the exterior design. They're of different heights, different proportions. It's like trying to modulate from one key to another in music. And so there's a series of studies of how to deal with that joint. And again, this is one of the marvels of the collection, to be able that they saved these sequences of sketches so that you can sort of see the fluidity of the design as it develops. And the last of the principal assistants was Charles Coolidge. He, along with George Shepley and Charles Rutan, would form the successor firm. And Coolidge had a particularly lovely kind of atmospheric touch to his drawings. This is one of the small public libraries, this one in Malden, with an idea for a church, unfortunately not built to Richardson's design, that would have formed a civic ensemble at the heart of the city. And then there are buildings and drawings where we really were not able to make attributions. This is a magnificent elevation of the Marshall Field store, but we did not feel confident to say who drew it or even who was the principal design assistant for this, extraordinary and, precedent-setting project. This drawing appears in two copies, one in Richardson's studio and one in the Olmsted studio, just a few blocks away from Richardson's house, also in Brookline. The drawing, like the design, may in fact be a collaboration, because this is a building, the Oaks Ames Hall in Northeaston, where the romantic Richardsonian building is sitting on these exposed ledges of the hillside that Olmsted had them kind of cut away to heighten the drama of the landscape. And then there's this amazing stone stair. It goes undulating over those ledges like a big stone serpent up to the entry arcade of the building. And so this is one of the finest collaborations of Richardson and Olmsted, and the drawing itself may be a collaboration of the two studios. After Whitehead left, probably the other finest artist was Francis Bacon. And Bacon made magnificent competition drawings like this one for the Pittsburgh courthouse, and this one as well. And this bird's eye view, I think, tells a very interesting story. It is, of course, it's a wonderful drawing, but it also shows the technical sophistication in Richardson's office. If you're looking down here on this industrial hellscape of Pittsburgh, the smog coming out of all of those coal-fired chimneys, the great tower at the center of the complex was not just a visual element, it was the center of the air conditioning system. The tower was 300 feet high so that it could draw in relatively clean air, which was sucked down by fans to the basement of the courthouse, run through filters to pick up the particulates, then heated in the furnaces, and then pushed over vats of water that would humidify the air before it then rose by gravity up through the ducting systems in the walls of the building to heat the courtrooms and the offices. And we attribute to Bacon this wonderful perspective of Trinity Church that's on the cover of the book. And this drawing shows how Richardson was never satisfied with his design. When Trinity Church was finished in 1877, the west front, the entrance front here, was just a blank wall. There was no porch. There were two rather truncated towers. He was never happy with that. And so at some point later, he had this perspective drawn to take to the church to show this is now what I want to do. It took some time, but 10 years after his death, they came back to the successor firm, and Charles Coolidge designed what you see today. It's a little more florid than Richardson would have done, but it is basically true to Richardson's design intent, as shown in this drawing. So as I've given a sense of, there are wonderful design drawings, wonderful competition and presentation drawings. There are also working drawings issued for construction. And that's another, there are some buildings that in the collection that are best represented in that way. And the working drawings themselves are often very beautiful. They would be drawn on vellum with ink, and then to show the materials, they would use a watercolor wash on the back, so that stone would be gray, masonry would be pink, wood would be yellow. So this is a floor plan for one of the wards at the mental asylum in Buffalo, which also indicates the therapeutic program of this hospital. This is a building in the late 1860s. There are not, in fact, large open wards. All of the patients have at most semi-private rooms shared by only 2 patients. And then this wide corridor that goes through, that was designed to be wide like that, opened to the sunlight, which would be then informally furnished with chairs, couches, tables, where the patients could gather together and where they could meet in an informal setting with the nurses and with the doctors. Here's a wonderful elevation drawing issued for construction of another Ames building, the Oliver Ames Library in Northeastern, and you can see in this composition how much Frank Lloyd Wright learned from this dynamic, asymmetrical composition of verticals and horizontals in his prairie houses. This is a section of the train station in Northeastern, where you can see the great arches that kind of give the character to the building, but you also see the ducting rising up under the floors that are bringing hot air to grills to keep your toes toasty when you're waiting for the commuter train to Boston on a cold winter morning. And this drawing is of the foundations that held up the 4 great pillars of the central tower of Trinity Church. You know, again, it's a beautiful piece of graphic art, but it also shows the forest of wooden foundations driven into the muck, the landfill of the Back Bay, with a mat floating over that, and then these stone pyramids rising up in the foundations. Whenever possible, Richardson liked to design every detail of the interior. This is a collection of sketches of the interiors of the double house he designed for Henry and Clover Adams and their good friend John Hay in Washington, D.C. These are furniture and interior details of the New York State Capitol in Albany. And this is a building that's been beautifully restored, and most of this furniture and most, including the grandfather clock, which is in the State Court of Appeals, have survived and have been very well preserved. And this is a lighting fixture for the now lost 8-story Chamber of Commerce building in Cincinnati, where the successor firm gives an almost Art Nouveau flair to the metal work of this light. So we're going to close now with, as I said, a case study, and that is Austin Hall at Harvard Law School, because it's one of the best represented in the collection and really, I think, gives a wonderful sense of the entire course of this collaborative design process. Austin Hall was intended to house the revolutionary new law teaching that had been pioneered by Dean Christopher Columbus Langdell. He had invented the case study method of teaching law. And so they had a donor, a merchant named Austin, who was willing to give $100,000 to the university. Unfortunately, Austin hated lawyers. And so it took some time for President Charles Eliot and for Ned Hooper, the treasurer, to kind of work on him and convince him that it was okay to spend the money on on a building for lawyers. They did eventually bring him around. Here is Richardson's kind of initial elevation sketch. And then here is a floor plan. And again, here you can get a sense, clearly this was done, with the care of the drafting, the care of the lettering of all the spaces. This must have been done for a client presentation. And you can see here what came out of that presentation, this big X across here and a big line drawn here that, as often happens, they decide, no, this really isn't working. We're going to have to put this wall here, move these rooms around. They kept working on this scheme for a long time. Here was, quite a handsome ink drawing of the front elevation. Here's a watercolor perspective of the front elevation where they've now shifted, looking at different proportions of the towers. They really completed the design up to this point, and nobody was happy with it. The client was unhappy with it because the classrooms were long and narrow and not well suited to the case study method. And Richardson, I think, must have been unhappy with it. You just look at this. This is not a happy design. He had never been able, the lump of the mass on the right just does not work with the wing on the left, no matter how hard they kept trying. So they went back to the donor. They got him to cough up another $50,000. And then they started again. And here you see the partie sketch that is the concept that worked, with this T-shaped plan, three amphitheater-style classrooms, one in the back, one in either wing, with then light coming in from all 3 sides for each of those classrooms. And, I can actually vouch for it. Having taken classes in this building, more than 100 years later, these rooms still work just as they were intended for the case study method. Not just the Socratic questioning of the students, but promoting debate among the students themselves with that amphitheater form. So Richardson, these are his initial sketches, but then they keep working on it. They did some more studies, and then, as Richardson often would, he would do another parti sketch of the next stage. Here they've pulled the two wings forward so that the front elevation is a single plane. It's become a little tighter, more compressed. We then see a series of elevation studies here, introducing some asymmetry in the windows into this symmetrical massing. Now introducing a tower to kind of give a little more dynamism to it. And then here, with really the final design, simplifying the roof still further, but also moving the tower from the left to the right. Then as today, the main approach to this building is on this diagonal from the left, from the Cambridge Common into the Harvard campus. And by putting that tower on the right, you are catching the movement, catching your eye, catching you visually, deflecting you into those recessed arches of the entry. And this is, of course, Richardson's understanding that above all else, architecture is the movement of bodies in space. And he deeply, deeply understood that. Here's from the construction set of drawings. This is a section through one of those amphitheater courtrooms. And again, as I said, there are wonderful stories in these drawings. This one, because it is this is a contract document, and so it is therefore signed by the client for Harvard, E.W. Hooper. That was Ned Hooper, who was part of the nest of Richardson's connections. He was Richardson's landlord in Brookline. He was the treasurer of Harvard, and his sister was married to Richardson's friend Henry Adams. Clover Hooper Adams, the brilliant and tragic wife of Henry Adams, was Ned's sister. So that set of stories is in that signature. And then here, Norcross Brothers. Norcross Brothers were Richardson's favored contractor, the leading contractor of their day. They built almost all of his buildings, and he trusted them enormously with their skill, their detailing, and just the overall quality of their construction. Then in the collection, you also see these wonderful studies as they're working through the stonework, reminding us that Richardson was deeply versed in Ruskin's notion that you do not apply ornament. Ornament grows out of the choice of materials and the ways in which they are put together. And you can see that in these watercolor studies. And then again, one of our favorites, there were 3 enormous fireplaces, one in each of the classrooms, and there are 16 different sketch designs for andirons. And we just can't help imagining that one day they just said to the whole studio, let's have a charrette. Everybody design an andiron, and then we're going to pick one of them. And so this is, as I said, 3 out of the 16. So really, I want to close now with another quote from Olmsted. He wrote to Richardson's biographer, Mariana van Rensselaer, about trying to characterize Richardson's attitude towards drawings. The way he put it, what Richardson believed was that the architect's most valuable appliances were tracing paper and India rubber. Nothing like tracing over tracing 100 times. There was no virtue in an architect more to be cultivated and cherished than a willing spirit to waste drawings. Never, never, till the thing was in stone beyond recovery, should the slightest indisposition be indulged to review, reconsider, and revise every particle of his work, to throw away his most enjoyed drawing the moment he felt it in him to better the design. And so I think that's, there's the fascination of this collection. These are instruments of service, means to an end. In his view, the building was what mattered, not the drawing. And yet the drawings, as I hope you will agree, are so often just compelling and beautiful objects in themselves. And I think maybe most of all, what they are is they are documents of the process of design, of the fascination of how design moves, circles back upon itself, simplifies, flowers. And so, we've had a wonderful time working with these drawings for 5 years. It's a pleasure to share them with you, and we hope that the book will inspire much more research in the Richardson collection and will inspire wonderful buildings in the future. So thank you very much.
This is a personal testimony. The Buffalo State Asylum, a small portion of it has been turned into the Richardson Hotel, which is a wonderful boutique hotel. My brother and I stayed there in August, and we experienced those wide, light-filled corridors, and I'll recommend it to anybody.
I would like you to talk about CAD, because I think a whole generation of designers and architects are heavily trained in CAD, but we don't have the brain-to-hand works of art that you have just showed us. So tell us what you think people will be doing in this room in 50 years with the architecture that's being designed today.
I'll start. So for anybody who doesn't know, CAD is computer assisted design. It is the process of translating architectural ideas into digital-based documentation. And it has transformed the architectural profession in a lot of ways, because a great deal of what you saw in these drawings today had as much to do with the tactile quality of drawing on paper and having a conversation with whoever the author of that particular sketch is in a very tangible way that could then be translated into another sketch, into another drawing, and ultimately conveyed to a contractor who would have been familiar with that process and the meanings of those drawings. Today we're moving towards a medium that's referred to as BIM architecture, Building Information Management projects, where you have three-dimensional models in the digital format. It has tremendous opportunities. It creates great ability to sort of visualize for clients a three-dimensional space in a way that these two-dimensional drawings didn't often convey, or convey in ways that the client might have. What it changes in some ways is the dynamic of the authority of the architect. Certainly for Richardson, his authority in his personal career was to a certain extent ultimate. You know, in the back of the first biography that Mariana Van Rensselaer writes, she reproduces a copy of his typical contract, and the contract is very fluid and talks about all the wonderful things he's guaranteeing that's going to happen. It's going to be a great building. But at the end is a small section that says, however, I will not guarantee that the client will agree fully with my design, because you have hired me for that skill set and I am bringing that to the table for you. And it wasn't as if there wasn't a collaboration between the two, but it really created the precedent in the same way that you think about your medical professionals as this is someone who's been quite well skilled in doing this work. And it's appropriate for us to convey what we want and have the confidence that they know how to extend it. So in other words, CAD is the death of architecture.
I'd say something that very much struck me throughout this presentation was the story of the cathedral and how that design bled into so many of his other designs as he was working on it over these years, and just all of these slight adjustments. And I was curious if there are other cases when you were going through the collection where certain projects really just spilled into everything else they were working on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and what you said about Trinity, you called it the cathedral because although it is Trinity Church, it is a cathedral, very, very clearly a cathedral in its expression. And you're absolutely right. That was really the point of his full maturity as an architect, but also because it went on for so long, it gave great opportunities. Although at the end, he was, not only was he not happy with the west facade, he was generally unhappy with it. He took the Glessners through it at the end, a couple of years before the end of his life when he was talking with them about their house and they were sitting in the church and he said, I don't understand why they ever gave me the commission with that first design. I could do so much better now. I think the other sort of pivotal one we would say is not a single building, but a relationship, and that was with the Ames family. And the 5 buildings in the little town of Northeaston, south of Boston, really run the full gamut of all of the different directions and explorations that he was making. And so to have a single client who gave him so many different opportunities to develop, I think that was very, very important to the latter part of his career.
You mentioned that you had looked through 4,000 drawings, of which 450 are in the book. Is there an online catalog available to look at the rest of the collection?
There is an online guide to the Richardson collection that you get to through Hollis, which is Harvard University Library's online catalog. The collection was given to Harvard in 1942 by the successor firm, and Richardson's grandson, Henry Richardson Shepley, was still a member of the firm at that time. And I think spearheaded the gift of the drawings to Harvard, but also Richardson's Architectural Library, which is at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and more than 50 albums of study photographs from Richardson's collection, also at the Graduate School of Design. We were concerned primarily with the drawings at Houghton Library. The total collection numbers about 5,000, but it includes drawings by the successor firms whenever they were asked to work on buildings by Richardson, expansions, remodelings, what have you. And for whatever reason, a few projects that were developed by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge after Richardson's death. The drawings went to Houghton Library, which was a newly opened, climate-controlled building, and it had space for large, flat drawings. The Graduate School, what is now the Graduate School of Design, was already in existence at Harvard, but it occupied a building now known as Robinson Hall, which was a McKim, Mead and White, very much Beaux-Arts building, and they didn't really have room for this material. It was also shortly after Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer became faculty members at the Graduate School of Design, and I suspect that they were not very interested in Richardson's work. So the drawings remained at Houghton Library after 1942, having previously been preserved by the firm, undoubtedly in part because they were relics of the founder. In the 1990s, Harvard received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which led to the recataloging, the reorganization physically of the collection, and a microfilming of the collection. And after that, it was possible to serve readers. During my tenure, nearly 20 years as curator of printing and graphic arts, we received requests from a number of researchers who were interested in Trinity Church or in the Hay Adams House or in the, some of the other drawings. James O'Gorman, who is the expert on Richardson and published many, many works on Richardson during the course of his career, and even after he retired from Wellesley, was frequently called on to consult about modifications to Richardson or restoration of Richardson buildings. He invariably came back to look at the drawings before each of those projects. And that is how I learned a lot about Richardson, finding drawings and supervising readers of drawings. And as Jay said, we hope that this book will encourage more people to appeal to Harvard and to Houghton Library for access to drawings.
But the digital collection's available to the public to access?
Yes, in the 90s, the entire collection was microfilmed, and there is, again, through the Hollis online catalog, there is access to those microfilmed images. Not very easy access, because when the conversion was done from the microfilms, they just converted it reel by reel. So you need some guidance as to how to find what you're interested in. But yes, those microfilm images are available online.
So Richardson's key assistants, McKim and White, made a successful career out of designing buildings that were specifically referential to earlier buildings from the history of Western architecture. Was there anything, did they learn that from Richardson? Was there anything in Richardson's architecture that suggested that he was looking at buildings from the history of architecture and reinterpreting them himself?
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a great question. I think he certainly was, and he was deeply versed in architectural history as well as in contemporary work. I'd say his range of reference was quite broad, because it went from the Romanesque through the Gothic into various, kind of vernaculars in England, in the United States, and some, in some of his early work is kind of overtly classical, and certainly I think people have referred to, something like the Marshall Field Store as speaking back to the Palazzo Medici and some of the, fortified Renaissance palaces. But I think the word you used was about transformed. I think he would transform in often quite startling ways. The whole idea of that wonderful sequence of 5 public libraries, of which we gave a couple of examples, the one in Northeastern. So he's taking a clearly medieval form of a kind of a small parish church to be used for an utterly unlike program, the public library. You are now entering that church in the wrong place, through the transept, rather than entering it at the end of the nave. And then with some of those, if you come around to the side and you look at the cross section, the roof is actually a salt box, where the roof comes down low, so that so this medieval church has transformed itself into a 17th century colonial New England farmhouse. So I think that's part of the fascination, is this kind of fluidity and merging and joining of elements and references.
I'd offer two more thoughts about that. One is that I think Richardson was very intentionally looking for an American style, an American sensibility in his design. And at that time, if you look at Richard Morris Hunt's work, he was really drawing from the vocabulary of European buildings as a precedent for what would be appropriate for this house or this building. Richardson was trying to see if there wasn't something that was more evocative of what the American spirit might be, for lack of a better term. But having said that, his library was extraordinary. He had some 2,000 volumes, something along those lines, in his office that he not only knew himself, but made available to his office staff to sort of educate themselves and be tutored by him when he wanted to make reference to a specific type of building or specific type of design style. So you see classical architecture throughout his building in various little details and bits and pieces. But I think ultimately it becomes his unique vocabulary.
And you see this also in the photograph albums that are at the Graduate School of Design. A great many of them record photographs that he acquired when he revisited Europe in 1882 and toured through southern France, Italy, and Spain. But there are albums that reflect what we would call a current English architecture, And there are albums that include photographs of early American buildings. So you see some reflection of the breadth of his interest in the photograph albums, which have never been systematically studied.
Although we're going to get to that.
Is it my imagination, or do I remember seeing a picture of a brooding Richardson in a monk's outfit, with almost with a hood over him? Very forbidding in that way.
Yes, no, that's he actually came. It was a New York photographer, and he came down and had a series taken in the studio of a New York photographer with this monk's outfit on. Yes, some of them rather stagey looking. A couple of them, there's one where the hood is thrown back. And it's actually just a very moving and beautiful portrait of his face, which is looking quite lined and tired at that point. The monk's outfit also had, there were sartorial reasons. Richardson weighed well over 300 pounds by the end of his life. He had to have his suits very specially tailored, and he was, I don't think he was sensitive, so the monk's robe was, a capacious garment, shall we say, for studio shots.
The other thing I would say to add to that is, if you look at photographs of Richardson when he's in Paris, shortly after he graduates from Harvard, he is a svelte 6'3" young man. This weight was not part of his life, his entire life. It was part of the kidney disease that ultimately killed him. And I think he really struggled with that in different ways. He also was less than careful about his diet as he grew older. But in those photos, when you look at it, particularly the one that Jay's referring to, you can see the age and the stress and the intensity on his face. It's a great image.
I have a question about Le Proust. You mentioned him in the beginning and talked about how Richardson had taken his ideas for spatial planning. But when you're looking at the drawings, do you look at every one thinking about Le Proust, especially the libraries? And because Le Proust obviously used structural metal and then brought it for decorative purposes as well. And just wondering, he's such a huge figure, whether he had a huge influence.
Yeah, actually, perhaps I should have been a little more clear. So this was actually not Theodore Le Proust. This was his. I'm sorry. This was Theodore Le Proust, not Henri Le Proust. So you have Henri Le Proust is the person we always think of, who was probably the greatest of the mid-19th century French architects, and did the wonderful Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève and the National Library. So Richardson was in his brother's office. His brother was also a very successful architect. The projects he was working on, there was a large hospital project in the office. I think there was also the Gare du Nord. Was that right?
I was just going to say, but yes. When he's working for Le Proust, he's not working as a designer. He's working as a student architect who is trying to keep himself together because all of his funds from New Orleans have dropped away. So he's trying to continue his education, but he's also trying to make a living. So his role was as a project architect. He was basically the guy that got sent to the field. And it was an extraordinary experience for a young person to see buildings of that scale and magnitude, and to be sort of schooled in that high quality building technique. And then to bring that back to the U.S. as only the second architect who had gone through the Beaux-Arts and was able to present himself as a real true skilled master architect.
In addition to working for Theodore Le Proust on the hospital at Ivry, he also worked for Jacques Ignaz Hittorf, who, despite his German name, was a French citizen and worked in Paris and had quite a large and successful career in mid-century Paris. But Hittorf's last main project was the reconstruction of the Gare du Nord, the North Station, train station in Paris. And Richardson is supposed to have worked for him as a project manager. We haven't been able to sort out exactly what Richardson did. The street facade of the building is a masonry building. Everything behind it is glass and iron. And if you know anything about Richardson's career, you know that there's a long discussion about his attitude towards the use of metal in buildings. But he must surely have been exposed to this when he was working for Hittorf.